So when you talk about this, you hope you don't sound pretentious, but the fact is that I never saw it as labeled as anything. Right. I just came into it because I wanted to act in the theater, and so I ended up in a college, and I was studying it with some teachers, and I was kind of making up what I would...
Philip Seymour Hoffman wasn't just respected, he was considered one of the most complete actors of his generation. His range, emotional depth, and total commitment set a standard few could match. Working with him meant stepping up or falling behind, and while many collaborators found it inspiring, not every working relationship was easy. Here are 6 actors who reportedly had serious tensions with him. Coming at number 6, John C. Reilly during Magnolia. At the time, both actors were part of an intense, emotionally heavy production under Paul Thomas Anderson. Hoffman's role as Phil Parma demanded deep emotional precision, and his level of commitment on set reportedly created a demanding atmosphere. While both actors delivered powerful performances, the pressure of that environment led to a working dynamic that wasn't always completely smooth. Reilly, cast as Jim Curring, the gentle and perpetually disoriented police officer whose earnest decency provides one of the film's emotional anchors, was a performer of genuine warmth and considerable screen intelligence whose approach to his craft operated from a set of instincts that were, in certain important respects, differently calibrated than Hoffman's. Both men were deeply serious about the work. Both brought to the Magnolia set a level of preparation and creative investment that reflected their understanding of what Anderson's material demanded. But the specific character of their creative processes, Hoffman's more internally excavating and psychologically absolute, Reilly's more externally generous and externally generous, created a dynamic within the production's ensemble that people who worked on the film described as carrying its own persistent undercurrent of creative friction.
The nature of ensemble productions of Magnolia scale is that the interpersonal dynamics within the cast inevitably shaped the working atmosphere in ways that affected every relationship within it. And the reported tension between Hoffman and Reilly was one of several such dynamics that Anderson and his team navigated throughout the shoot. The particular character of their friction was rooted in the implicit competition of 2 performers whose roles carried equivalent emotional weight within the film's structure, but whose approaches to sustaining that weight across a demanding and extended production schedule were not naturally complementary. People who observed the Magnolia production closely noted that the working atmosphere between Hoffman and Reilly required more active management from Anderson than the director had initially anticipated, and that finding a working rhythm that allowed both men to access their best work simultaneously was a task that consumed considerable directorial energy throughout the shoot. Neither man allowed the reported tension to compromise the finished work in any way that audiences could perceive, and both performances in Magnolia are among the most genuinely affecting in either career. But the process of achieving those performances within a working dynamic that generated its own persistent friction was something that people connected to the production described with enough consistency and enough specificity to establish it as a genuine feature of the behind-the-scenes reality of one of the most celebrated American films of its decade. At number 5, we look at a dynamic that played out on one of the more commercially significant productions of Hoffman's career, the reported tensions between him and Tom Cruise during the filming of J.J. Abrams' Mission Impossible 3 in 2006. Cruise was, at the time of that production, still one of the most powerful and most commercially dominant performers in Hollywood, a man whose creative authority within any production he was attached to was total in a way that shaped every relationship and every decision within its environment. He was also, in the specific context of 2006, navigating a period of unusual public scrutiny and personal exposure that had generated a cultural conversation around him that was unlike anything in his previous experience, and that inevitably shaped the atmosphere of the productions he was working on during that period.
Hoffman had been cast as Owen Davian, the arms dealer whose cold, remorseless intelligence provides the film's central threat. The role was a departure for a franchise that had typically populated its villain positions with a certain kind of operatic menace. Hoffman's Davian was something more genuinely unsettling than that, a character whose danger was communicated through a quality of absolute stillness and psychologically precise contempt that was entirely the product of Hoffman's specific creative gifts and entirely unlike anything the franchise had previously offered in that role. The preparation he brought to Davian was characteristically exhaustive. He had developed a complete psychological architecture for the character that informed every choice he made on screen with a specificity that went well beyond what a summer action franchise typically demanded or accommodated. The reported tension with Cruise was rooted in the particular difficulty that arises when a performer of Hoffman's creative seriousness and process-driven intensity inhabits a production whose creative culture is organized around a very different set of priorities. Cruise's authority within Mission Impossible 3 was comprehensive. His role as both star and producer meant that his instincts about the film's direction, tone, and pacing carried an authority that shaped every creative decision from the script stage forward. Hoffman's own strongly held convictions about how Davian should be inhabited and the specific working conditions that his process required in order to function at the level he held himself to did not always find natural accommodation within a production whose priorities were organized around the requirements of a franchise star rather than the psychological needs of a character actor working in a supporting role. People connected to the production described a dynamic dynamic between Hoffman and Cruise that was characterized by a professional distance rooted in fundamentally different relationships to the creative environment of the film. Both delivered work that served the franchise's needs. Cruise with the practiced confidence of a man entirely at home in the world the film was inhabiting. Hoffman with the concentrated intensity of someone bringing everything he had to a role that the production's commercial priorities would have allowed him to approach with considerably less commitment. The tension between those two orientations was real and persistent, and the people who witnessed it noted that the working atmosphere between the two men never found the ease of genuine creative alliance. Coming down to number 4, we look at the reported friction that developed between Hoffman and Meryl Streep during the production of John Patrick Shanley's Doubt in 2008. This was a production of extraordinary cultural and artistic weight, an adaptation of Shanley's Pulitzer Prize-winning play, whose central confrontation between Streep's iron-willed sister Aloysius and Hoffman's charming, ambiguous father Flynn carried one of the most morally complex and genuinely unresolved dramatic arguments that American theater had produced in a generation. The material was the kind that demanded everything from both performers, and both arrived with precisely that level of commitment. Streep's preparation for Sister Aloysius was the kind of total architectural construction that her most celebrated performances are built on, a character assembled from specific physical choices, precise vocal work, and a psychological certainty about the nun's worldview and its internal logic that was complete and fully formed from the earliest stages of production. Hoffman's approach to Father Flynn operated from an equally serious foundation, but a fundamentally different creative principle. Where Streep's process built certainty and control, Hoffman's required a quality of genuine psychological openness and moral ambiguity that could not be fixed in advance without compromising the character's essential quality of unknowability. Flynn's power in the story depends entirely on the audience being unable to resolve the question of his guilt, and sustaining that genuine ambiguity required Hoffman to resist the kind of definitive internal decision-making that Streep's process naturally moved toward. The reported tension between them was, at its core, the productive but genuinely difficult friction of two creative processes whose governing principles were in direct opposition, working simultaneously on material that required both of those principles to be fully honored in the same frame. People who worked on Doubt described a working environment in which the atmospheric charge between Hoffman and Streep was something the entire production felt, not as destructive conflict, but as the specific and demanding quality of two creative forces of absolute magnitude in genuine contention with each other, neither willing to yield the integrity of their approach to the character for the convenience of a more comfortable working dynamic. Both performers understood completely what the material required of them, and both were utterly committed to providing it, and the collision of those equally total commitments generated a creative friction that was, by consistent account from the production, as demanding to work within as it was extraordinary to observe. Shanley, navigating the challenge of directing two of American cinema's most formidable creative personalities in his own material, has spoken about the production in terms that reflect a genuine awareness of the extraordinary interpersonal dynamics he was managing throughout the shoot. The finished film carries the specific quality of genuine dramatic contention between its two central performances that no amount of purely technical craft could have manufactured. The sense that two people are actually genuinely fighting for the truth of an unresolvable moral question. That quality was the product, at least in significant part, of a real and sustained creative tension that cost both performers real professional effort to navigate, and that left its mark on everyone who was present for it. At number 3, we arrive at a tension that unfolded across one of the more demanding and psychologically intense productions of Hoffman's career, the complicated dynamic that reportedly developed between him and Joaquin Phoenix during the filming of Paul Thomas Anderson's The Master in 2012. This was a production of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary difficulty, a film whose exploration of the relationship between a charismatic cult leader and his most devoted and most destructive disciple required both of its central performers to access and sustain psychological territory of unusual depth and genuine personal cost across a production schedule that placed demands on them that went beyond the conventional requirements of dramatic performance. Phoenix, cast as Freddie Quell, the volatile, sexually obsessive, psychologically shattered veteran whose attachment to Hoffman's Lancaster Dodd becomes the film's central dynamic, was delivering work of such raw and unmediated intensity that people who witnessed it during production described the experience as genuinely unsettling in its proximity. His process of inhabiting Freddie was total and physically consuming. He had transformed himself physically for the role, was sustaining a behavioral and psychological state throughout the production that made ordinary social interaction with him nearly impossible during filming, and was bringing to every scene an emotional extremity that set the creative temperature of the entire production at a level of sustained intensity that everyone around him was required to navigate. Hoffman's approach to Lancaster Dodd, the imperious, brilliantly manipulative founder of a Scientology-adjacent philosophical movement, required an entirely different kind of creative discipline. Where Phoenix's process was disintegrating and physically raw, Hoffman's was architecturally controlled and psychologically precise, built on a detailed understanding of the specific kind of charismatic authority and intellectual vanity that made Dodd simultaneously magnetic and monstrous. The challenge of sustaining that control in consistent proximity to the specific energy Phoenix was generating, the challenge of maintaining Dodd's commanding composure,
exposure while performing opposite someone operating at the outer edge of psychological self-exposure was one that people on The Master described as creating a creative friction between the two men that was real and persistent throughout the production. The reported tension was not simple or one-directional. Hoffman's genuine admiration for Phoenix's extraordinary gifts was real, and Phoenix's awareness of what Hoffman was achieving in the role was equally real. But the collision of their creative processes in the shared space of scenes that required them to sustain a dynamic of profound psychological power and equally profound psychological submission created a working dynamic that was, by consistent account from people connected to the production, one of the most charged and most demanding interpersonal realities any of them had witnessed on a professional film set. Anderson's navigation of that dynamic, his ability to channel the genuine tension between his two lead performers into the specific quality of barely controlled violence and adoration that defines Freddie and Dodd's relationship on screen, was one of the more remarkable acts of directorial management in his extraordinary career. The finished film carries the electricity of two creative forces in genuine and sustained contention, and understanding that the contention was real is essential to understanding why the film works as powerfully as it does. At number 2, we arrive at one of the most specifically documented and most humanly revealing of all the tensions in Hoffman's professional life: the complicated working dynamic between him and Seymour Hoffman and his longtime collaborator and friend, the director Sidney Lumet, and more pointedly, the reported friction that developed between Hoffman and Ethan Hawke during the production of Lumet's Before the Devil Knows You're Dead in 2007. Lumet was, by the time of this production, one of the most experienced and most respected directors in the history of American cinema, and the film he was making, a moral thriller about two brothers whose botched robbery of their parents' jewelry store sets off a cascade of devastating consequences, was among the finest work of his final decade. Hoffman and Hawke were cast as the two brothers, Andy and Hank Hansen, whose relationship anchors the story's examination of guilt, family, and the particular cruelty of people who love each other badly. Hawke was a performer of genuine ability and considerable creative intelligence, whose career had traced a distinctive path between independent and commercial work, and who brought to the production an approach to Hank, the weaker, more passive, and ultimately more conventionally sympathetic of the two brothers, that was emotionally accessible and humanly grounded in ways that served the material's requirements effectively. Hoffman's Andy was something of an entirely different order, a character of immense and destructive psychological complexity, driven by desperation and self-deception, and a quality and barely controlled implosion that drew on Hoffman's deepest creative reserves and demanded a level of sustained psychological excavation that the production's intensity only amplified. The reported tension between Hawke and Hoffman was rooted in the fundamental asymmetry of the creative demands their respective roles placed on them, the difference between a performer being asked to sustain extraordinary psychological extremity across a complete production and a performer working at the level of genuine but less all-consuming commitment within the same shared space. Hoffman's process when working at the level that Andy Hansen required was, by accounts from people who worked on the film, genuinely difficult to be in close professional proximity to, not because he was unprofessional or unkind, but because the specific quality of psychological absorption that he brought to the character left very little room for the ordinary human accommodations of collaborative working life, and the pressure that created for Hawke across the full duration of a production that was already emotionally demanding was something that people close to the shoot described with notable consistency. Lumet's ability to manage the dynamic between the two performers, drawing on decades of experience handling the full range of human complexity that film sets can generate, was one of the production's defining behind-the-scenes features, and people who worked on Before the Devil Knows You're Dead described the director's navigation of the Hawke-Hawke dynamic as one of the more impressive examples of his directorial skill in a career defined by it. The finished film contains some of the most devastating and specific dramatic performances of either man's career, and the tension of their working relationship is inseparable from the quality of what they produced within it.
And now we arrive at number 1, the most complex, most extensively documented, most personally significant, and most profoundly revealing of all the difficult working relationships in Philip Seymour Hoffman's professional life. This is the story of his dynamic with Dustin Hoffman, no family relation, across the period of their careers when their professional paths most directly and most consequentially intersected, and more specifically, the deeply layered and carefully observed tension that surrounded their shared inhabitation of the same tradition of American psychological realism in ways that made their professional encounters simultaneously a meeting of genuine creative kinship and a collision of strongly individual creative identities that did not always find comfortable common ground. To understand the full dimensions of this dynamic, it is necessary first to appreciate what Dustin Hoffman represented to Philip Seymour Hoffman, not merely as a performer, but as a figure of foundational importance to the entire artistic tradition that the younger man had built his identity within. Dustin Hoffman was not simply a famous actor who existed in the same general professional landscape. He
He was one of the primary architects of the psychological realism in American screen acting that Philip Seymour Hoffman had absorbed as gospel. A performer whose work in The Graduate, Midnight Cowboy, Kramer vs. Kramer, and Tootsie had demonstrated the full range and the full human depth of what total immersive commitment to a character could produce on screen, and whose influence on the generation of American actors who came of age in the 70s and 80s was so pervasive that it was almost impossible to fully account for. For Philip Seymour Hoffman, working in the shadow of that influence while simultaneously developing a creative identity that was entirely and unmistakably his own was one of the central professional and psychological tasks of his career. The specific and most extensively discussed instance of the tension between the two men emerged in the context of various industry settings and shared professional spaces where their paths crossed, and in the particular quality of complicated creative awareness that their encounters generated in people who were present to observe them. Multiple accounts from people who knew both men and who moved in the shared professional world they inhabited described a dynamic characterized by the particular friction that arises when a figure of enormous historical significance in a specific tradition encounters the person who has most completely and most individually extended that tradition into the present. When the originator and the inheritor occupy the same room and each is fully aware of the complexity of what that encounter means.
Dustin Hoffman's well-documented tendency towards creative possessiveness, the intensity of his investment in his own approach to the craft, and the difficulty he sometimes experienced in accommodating the equally total and equally strongly held creative convictions of other performers of serious intent was something that found particular expression in his encounters with a younger actor whose gifts were sufficiently extraordinary that the comparison between them was not only inevitable, but specifically pointed. Philip Seymour Hoffman's work had, by the time of his most significant encounters with Dustin Hoffman, established him in the critical and industry conversation as not merely a worthy heir to the tradition the older man represented, but as someone whose specific achievements had extended that tradition into territory that Dustin Hoffman's own body of work had not reached. That assessment, held widely in the critical community and within the industry's own internal conversations, created a dynamic between the two men that was not simply the ordinary professional complexity of two strong creative personalities encountering each other. It was the more specific and more psychologically loaded complexity of a foundational figure confronting the work of someone whose achievements implicitly measured the distance between what had been established and what had been built upon it. People who witnessed their interactions in various professional contexts described encounters characterized by a quality of layered creative awareness that generated real friction, not through direct confrontation, but through the particular tension that accumulates when two people each understand, with complete clarity, the specific terms of the comparison being made between them, and each have strong and differently motivated feelings about its implications. What makes this dynamic the most significant entry in Philip Seymour Hoffman's professional story is the broader meaning it carries about the specific challenge of working at the highest level within a tradition that has already produced its defining achievements, and the particular kind of psychological and creative pressure that generates for the performer who has committed to extending that tradition further than it has previously gone. Philip Seymour Hoffman's entire career was, in a meaningful sense, defined by his relationship to the standard that Dustin Hoffman and the generation he represented had established, a standard he honored completely, internalized totally, and ultimately exceeded in ways that the finished work of his career makes impossible to dispute. The tension between the two men was, at its deepest level, not a personal conflict, but a creative one, the productive and genuinely costly friction of an artistic tradition interrogating its own evolution through the specific human beings most completely identified with its past and its present. Hoffman's death in February 2014, at 46 years old, cut short a career that had already produced a body of work of extraordinary range and depth, and that showed every indication of continuing to develop in ways that the industry was genuinely and specifically anticipating. The tensions explored here were not incidental to that career. They were woven into it with the same threads that produced its achievements, and that speak to the specific and irreplaceable quality of creative seriousness that he brought to everything he did, and that made certain professional dynamics genuinely difficult in the same measure that it made the work genuinely extraordinary. But not every collaboration turned into conflict. Among the working relationships that Hoffman navigated with genuine warmth and deep creative joy, two stand out with particular and consistent prominence across the testimony of everyone who knew and worked with him closely. His creative partnership with director Paul Thomas Anderson was, by the accounts of everyone connected to their multiple collaborations, one of the most genuinely nourishing and completely trusting director-actor relationships in contemporary American cinema. Anderson understood Hoffman's process with a specificity and a depth that allowed him to create the conditions in which the actor's most extraordinary work consistently
consistently emerged, and Hoffman's gratitude for that understanding was something he expressed with a consistency and a warmth that reflected how rare and how profoundly valuable he found it. His working relationship with Amy Ryan, his co-star in several productions, and a performer whose creative seriousness and psychological depth matched his own in ways that he found genuinely sustaining rather than generating the competitive friction that characterized some of his more difficult collaborations, was one that people who observed them working together described as among the most mutually generous and creatively alive partnerships of his career. The ease and the human warmth of what they produced together in shared work was something that those who witnessed it found both remarkable and deeply moving.
The career of Philip Seymour Hoffman, considered in its full and irreplaceable dimension, is the story of a man who understood what the work could be and refused, with a consistency that the people around him found both inspiring and genuinely difficult to sustain alongside, to accept anything less than that understanding's complete realization. The tensions explored here were the shadow of that refusal, the inevitable cost of standards that do not accommodate compromise, and that produced in the work they drove some of the most honest and most permanently affecting screen performances that the craft of acting has ever generated. What he gave to that craft and what the craft cost him in return remains one of the most extraordinary and most sobering stories in the history of American cinema.